Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. On Sunday, 1st of November 2021, COP26 begins in Glasgow. And over the course of the next 4 episodes, we'll be discussing why this is such an important moment for our planet. Before we start though, I was joined by one of Scotland's leading artists, Gerard Burns, in a coffee shop just outside the City Chambers in George Square, as he was making the final arrangements before unveiling a breathtaking new painting called Our Future, created specially for COP26.
So the idea of the painting's called Our Future. If this conference is about anything at all, it's about exactly that. It's about the future. Maybe not my future as a 60-year-old man, but my children's future, and definitely my grandchildren's future. So it was important to me that the painting was about kids. What could be more obviously symbolic if you're trying to say something about the future than to use young children? It also was important to me that the painting should reflect the multicultural nature of the city of Glasgow. We have this incredibly rich diversity of different nationalities within the city, so the painting had to say something about that. And in order to find the models, I partnered up with a wonderful wee school out in the east end of Glasgow called St Anne's. I had worked with them previously and I knew that they had an amazing diversity of different nationalities in the school. So they chose a number of kids for me. I met with them a day just before the end of the summer holidays, and I took some photographs basically for the painting. The surprise to all of us was that we also ended up with a song. I was a musician, I am a songwriter, and I knew that in the school, when I'd worked with them previously, it was around about a song that the kids had written. So I knew there was a real rich musical tradition in the school. And I'm not quite sure how it came about. There was a conversation between the deputy head, Marie Hamilton, and myself, where one of us kind of said, wouldn't it be great if? And on the journey home from the school to the studio, I got a song. I got the chorus for a song and the bare bones of a verse.
And that's the young people in St Anne's that we can hear in the start of the podcast, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The bird, the bell, the fish and the tree, a song for all children, for you and for me. This precious world is weeping, you see. It's now or never, it's time to believe. Mother Glasgow, fill our face in your embrace. God has standing us in this dear request. Mother Glasgow, in your eyes, there's no place to hide. The whole world is watching, it's time to decide. The whole world is watching, it's time to decide. The whole world is waiting for us to decide.
You are listening to the Our Dear Green Place podcast. My name's Paul Downie and I'm a biology teacher here in Glasgow.
And I'm Doug Allan, a wildlife documentary cameraman who lives in Bristol but came from Scotland.
And over the course of the next 4 episodes, we're going to take you through the key issues around COP26 as it's taking place in Glasgow and what the challenges we're facing are when we talk about climate change. For those that don't know you, Doug, you've obviously worked on some pretty major wildlife documentaries during your career, and you've spent a long time in some seriously remote and wild places on our planet.
Well, it's true, Paul. Yeah, one of the great things about wildlife filmmaking is that you get given a lot of time to spend in wild places. And if you're lucky, you get the chance to see some things that quite possibly no one has ever seen before. Two of them come to mind. We were up in the Arctic, or we heard when we were in UK, we heard about these belugas that were trapped in a hole in the Arctic. And what happened is that the belugas normally, they go into ice, but the ice has to be broken up because they have to come to the surface to breathe. Anyway, they had been swimming in open water, and then it was a very cold sort of overnight, and the ice, the whole sea froze round about them, and they ended up that they had to keep surfacing in this one hole to simply breathe. There was about 30 or 40 of them. And polar bears discovered this hole that the belugas were trapped in, and the polar bears started hunting these poor old belugas. And we heard about this, so we got our act together quickly, and we flew up to the Arctic and then drove out with an Inuit guide. We managed to get a couple of shots of polar bears trying to attack these poor old belugas in this hole. And then a good bit later on, I was also one of the cameramen, myself and Doug Anderson, another Scottish cameraman. We've got the behaviour of those killer whales, where again they go into the pack ice in the Antarctic and they pop their heads up, look around, and when they find a seal lying on top of the ice floes, the killer whales have got this amazing behaviour where half a dozen of them will line abreast, and they'll swim towards the ice floe, beating their tails in unison and creating a wave that's big enough to wash the seal off the ice floe into the water, where the killer whales managed to grab the seal. And that behaviour had been, a few people had seen it, but not very many. And we were the first camera team to actually film it. And it's very spectacular when you see it. It's such a cool, intelligent, requiring, it needs a lot of intelligence for whales to cooperate like that. And it was just remarkable to see how they did it, and to see it not just once, but to see it, we saw it about a couple of dozen times, over the couple of weeks that we were down there looking for them. So when you get something like that, something that hasn't been seen before, and you get the chance to film it properly, and then you get David putting the narration on the top, and the best editors come in, producers, and it gets the publicity that it deserves. It's pretty satisfying, I can tell you.
I'm not sure if people listening picked up on you there, Doug, on first name terms with Sir David Attenborough.
Well, it was David actually who got me into the business in a way. I met David when I was working in the Antarctic. He came onto our base fairly unexpectedly. He was travelling on a Navy ship. He came on our base for a couple of days with a very small film crew, and I got the chance to help him and his film crew. And I just watched and listened, and I thought, oh, what a fantastic job these people are having. And so I asked them, how do you become a wildlife filmmaker? And they were very generous with their advice. And I was doing a lot of stills at the time, but hadn't thought about movie. But David said, what you know about the Antarctic is pretty useful. I don't know anyone else who knows the Antarctic and diving under the ice and things. I don't know anyone who knows it like you do. So he was kind of hinting, play to your strengths. So I just worked on that and managed to bought myself a camera and managed to sell some footage that I got to the BBC. And that was just the way it went. And I have filmed with David on many occasions, and all I can say is that everybody thinks and knows that he's a great man, and he is a great man. He's a wonderful storyteller, he's great company, and he's very, very generous. And he's one of the world's nice guys, put it that way. He's a wonderful man. And we're very lucky to have him around, especially at COP, because people will and people should listen to him.
An absolute legend in every sense of the word, that's for sure.
Completely. And
you're on first name terms with him. That's amazing.
Well, it's, yes, I do say I've shared the Mars bar with David Attenborough. That's my claim to fame.
Did you not get him his own Mars bar?
We were running a bit short. I can't remember. I think actually it was my Mars bar that he shared. It wasn't his. It was me being generous to him.
No, David Attenborough doesn't share food, Doug. The podcast is simply one part, though, of phenomenal amount of work that's been taking place across schools and the rest of the city here in Glasgow in recent weeks as we prepare for COP, much of which has been under the banner of Our Dear Green Place. Now, the name Glasgow means Dear Green Place, and it's derived from the Brythonic, which is the language of the Britons who inhabited the British kingdoms, such as Strathclyde in the 6th century, when people started living in the area. What does Our Dear Green Place mean to you, Doug?
Well, I would take a global perspective on it, Paul. I mean, if you look at our planet from out in space, there are two colours. There's blue and there's green. And the green part and the blue part are really what's important. That's what COP's all about, saving these two parts.
And of course, you spent a lot of time in the blue part, really, didn't you?
Well, funnily enough, I spent a lot of time in the blue part, and I suppose there's a white part as well. You know, the poles. I've spent a lot of time in the poles. That was where I started. I started off working in the Antarctic as a scientist. And boy, you know, I can see the changes. I have been back. There used to be one glacier on the island that I worked on. And to cross this glacier, you had to go onto the glacier and cross over it because the glacier ran right into the sea. Now, you just walk around the beach in front of the glacier. It has receded 30, 40 metres in the 40 years since I was first of all there. And that's kind of typical. Glaciers at the poles are in retreat.
And over the course of the next few episodes, we'll hear a lot more about your own experience in some of these cold places and some of the changes that you've seen through that time. In the meantime, though, let's head back to the City Chambers. And we're going to hear from the head of Glasgow City Council.
So I'm Councillor Susan Aiken, and I'm the leader of Glasgow City Council.
What does it mean for Glasgow hosting COP26?
So we're probably the world's most talked about city just now, Glasgow. And I'm not sure that we really appreciate that at home very much, but I've been talking for the past year at least. I've been on Zoom and on various online programs talking to people from right across the world, often leaders of other cities, about Glasgow, and everyone is talking about us. And even, you know, John Kerry, the US Special Envoy on climate change, the former senator, when he first started talking about Glasgow, didn't know how to pronounce us, but now he does. And
how did he say it?
He said Glasgow. He said, which is quite common with Americans to pronounce it that way. They always pronounce Edinburgh wrong as well. They always say Edinburgh because I think that's how Americans pronounce cities like that a lot of the time. But so we are the world's most talked about city. And when he says Glasgow is the last best chance for the world, what he means is the most important decisions really that probably any of the current world leaders are going to make in their time as world leaders are going to be made right here in Glasgow, in our city. And hopefully at the end of COP26, there will be a Glasgow Accord or a Glasgow Agreement or something like that. And for many years to come, people will talk about that moment when the planet changed course, when we decided collectively that we were going to do better and that we were going to work together to limit global warming and to try and preserve the planet for the future instead of stopping destroying it. It all happened here in Glasgow. So it's an absolutely historic moment. But more than that, it's a real opportunity for us as a city to really address some of the issues and some of the challenges that we've had for a long time. So all cities are imperfect. I always say that every great city, and Glasgow's a great city, are works in progress. They always have to improve. They always have to do better. Cities always need to move forward. And there are some things in Glasgow that we've struggled with for a long, long time. We've struggled to fix. We've got too many people living in poverty. There are too many parts of the city that aren't right physically to support people's health and their well-being. And sometimes the city's difficult to manage in different ways just because the way that we were built. And you know, litter collection and is one of those things, for example, that can be quite challenging in a city like Glasgow, just with the way that we're built. So COP26 gives us an opportunity to really think about what kind of city do we want to be? What changes do we need to make to get Glasgow to be the kind of city that is not only carbon neutral or net zero carbon emissions, which we want to do by 2030, but also while we're doing that, we fix a lot of these challenges that we've had for a long time. And it's not a cheap thing to do. It needs quite a lot of investment in order to deliver those interventions. But with COP26 being here, everyone's looking at Glasgow, everyone's talking about Glasgow, and we're able to talk to the world and see, here are our plans for change. Here's how we want to make things better for our city and our citizens. Please come and work with us, come and collaborate and be in partnership with us to help us deliver that. And that's already happening. We're already, even before COP26 has taken place, we're having great conversations with people all around the world about how we can really go faster in doing the things for Glasgow that we've maybe wanted to do for a long time, but there have been various barriers in the way. We can move those barriers out of the way and we can go faster in making the city better for everyone.
That's us just heard about what COP means to Glasgow. But I think before we go into the intricacies, into the details of what COP is going to be talking about, we should come back to some basics, I think. And one of the basics is, what is the difference between weather and climate? We've got this big conference about climate. What's the difference between climate and weather?
So basically, the difference between weather and climate is basically a measure of time. So the weather's obviously the conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time, and the climate's how the atmosphere behaves over a relatively long period of time. And BBC weather presenter Judith Ralston has a really nice little explanation.
Climate is almost like your personality, and weather is like your day-to-day mood. So very slowly as you grow up or grow older, your personality changes slightly. You become the person that you're going to be. So that's what climate can be compared to. But weather is just like your day-to-day mood. Some days you're up, some days you're down, some days you're kind of neutral.
So what is it we really mean when we talk about climate change? There's a lot of talk about climate change just now getting into COP. What do we mean by that?
Well, climate change, it's always changed, but long-term changes in weather we experience day to day really are what sums up the expression climate change. Now, climate's always changed since the Ice Age and beyond that. The changes that we're seeing right now, though, they're happening more quickly, and it's people like you and me and my generation and above who are really noticing the big changes because they're happening fairly quickly within our lifetime.
When we talk about climate change, we talk about changes in long-term averages of daily weather. And climate change is the global challenge that our leaders from around the world are coming to Glasgow to discuss at COP26. So let's hear a little bit more about the conference itself.
So my name is Adam Vaughan. I'm a reporter at New Scientist magazine, and I spend a lot of my time covering climate change.
And you're, of course, the chief reporter for New Scientist, a magazine that myself and lots of science teachers across the country will be familiar with, and lots of our young people too. So thanks very much for taking the time to join us. Adam, what is COP26?
Well, it doesn't help that it has a ridiculous name for starters. So COP26 is the 26th Conference of the Parties. So these are the countries that in the 90s agreed to tackle climate change and avoid its most catastrophic outcomes. In terms of this particular meeting in Glasgow, it's basically the most important international meeting on climate change since 2015, when nearly 200 governments met and agreed the Paris Agreement, which was this historic treaty which had some sort of surprising levels of ambition in, including a goal of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. So the job of Paris was to create a treaty, so the world would, so everyone knew where we were going. The job of Glasgow is basically to deliver some action that's commensurate with the challenge. So as we go into Glasgow, the problem is basically there's a massive gap between what the science demands and where countries are at the moment. So we had the big IPCC report in August, the first part of 3 of what are known the assessment reports as they're known, and that basically told us, it was a reminder of why 1.5 degrees is a much better place for us all to land in terms of extreme weather, in terms of food production, in terms of wildlife, in terms of all the rest of the climate impacts than 2 degrees, which is the other target of the Paris Agreement. So what we know we need to get to 1.5 degrees is a 45%, roughly half cut in global emissions by the end of this decade. And unfortunately, as we approach COP26, the plans that countries have put forwards, these which are known as nationally determined contributions in the jargon, NDCs, those plans unfortunately don't give us a 45% cut by 2030. They in fact add up to a 16% increase by 2030. So that's the main goal of COP26, is to, in a weird, the funny thing about COP26 as a summit is, in a way, the main action happens before. The actual summit itself is almost the forcing mechanism that makes all those plans come, because it's this moment where every head of state, it has their moment in the limelight or the spotlight, as it were, and are being scrutinized. So weirdly, the most important thing is what happens in these plans before the summit.
And obviously, not just what happens before COP26 itself, but equally what happens after it.
Yeah, so I mean, clearly, that I think Paris. What a lot of people said, well, Paris is leaving it too much to sort of governments to do their own thing and too much of a bottom-up approach. But actually, I think we can see in terms of what's happened, in terms of the price of various green technologies, from renewables such as wind and solar power to electric vehicles and all the rest of it. I think we can see that clearly, some of the actions governments have taken since, and the actions that the private sector have taken since, have had an impact, and countries have put forward climate plans, and in the last year some have put forward much better, more ambitious ones. So the United States is an obvious example, along with the UK and the EU as a bloc. So they've all put forward much better plans, as have some other key countries like Japan, but unfortunately we're still missing plans by the real biggies, which is China and India principally. And also several of the G20 countries have either put forward a plan that is basically the old plan with no new ambition, which sucks. So countries like Australia, Brazil have basically done that, which is totally against the spirit of the Paris Agreement, because there's literally a line in the Paris Agreement that says when you put new plans, it'll be more progressive. So
they've just done a copy-paste job.
They have, in a couple of cases, they've literally done a copy and paste job. In others, they've done even worse. Without getting too much into the weeds, in others they've done really cheeky things like, Brazil basically changed so all these cuts are obviously measured from a baseline year, right? You have to pick a year, and they increased the number that they increased the number for that baseline year. Therefore, it's actually watering down their emissions cut in effect. So so there's not, it's been a mixed picture. I think it's fair to say, in terms of the plans. I think what China and India do is going to be crucial, and although they are leaving it to the last minute, they are still expected to do something.
Do you think they're maybe leaving it to the last minutes with big plans up their sleeves so that they can come in and take the limelight?
It's hard to say. I mean, there was a lot of talk that India was considering a long-term climate plan just before Joe Biden's summit in April, that there was going to be a net zero, and that it was a sort of political infighting that meant it didn't come out. It's not entirely clear what happened there. China, we've got a better sense of what China are going to do, because Xi Jinping basically stood up in September 2020 and told us. They just haven't translated it into a formal plan yet. So what we know about the headline thing about China is the plan at the moment, their current climate plan is to peak their emissions around 2030. And that's quite important because, well, it's extremely important because they're 28% of global emissions. So China is a huge emitter, partly because of its huge size. And the new plan, which she announced last year, was to peak emissions before 2030. So that might sound like sort of kind of crazy semantics to be around 20 versus before, but for economy of that, an economy of that size, it's actually really important. The truth is, we're not going to meet the goals that the science demands without China.
And what goals does the science demand then?
Well, the interesting thing is the science partly has come about as a result of the Paris Agreement in 2015. So this sort of surprise insertion of a 1.5 degree target to pursue efforts, as they put it. And what came out of that was the commissioning of a special report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So all the world's top researchers were sent away to go and do a review of all the existing scientific literature on what basically the difference would be between a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world in terms of the impacts on humans and the impacts on ecosystems and wildlife, and all the rest of it, all the physical impacts. And that report was, that report sort of got boiled down in the media and sort of public discourse as a 12 years to save the planet. So it focused, that was how it was sort of distilled by a lot of people, which is a sort of rough approximation of what it says. It was about the carbon budget that it implied. But I think that's what people focused on. But what that report really made clear was every 0.1 degree, it spelled out in very forensic detail what each 0.1 extra degree of warming will mean in terms of impacts. So it also made quite a lot of progress on, which the more recent IPCC report did as well, made quite a lot of progress on attribution of extreme weather events to climate change, which is important as well. So in terms of what that report really spelled out, to come back to your question of what the science demands, that 2018 IPCC report, it basically told us, it gave us the numbers on how much we need to cut emissions by. So that's where this sort of figure comes from, of a 45% cut in global emissions by 2050 to stand a sort of 50% chance of staying below 1.5. That's where that came from.
You obviously said there is a gap between what the science demands and the expectations and what's in those indices. Can that picture change once these leaders arrive at the event? Could we see a sort of shift and could we see them step up to do that? Is that still achievable?
So no, not really is the sad answer to that. That's the honest answer. There's no way that this summit is going to single-handedly close what people call the emissions gap. So, this is the gap between what you need for 1.5 degrees and what the current plans add up to. It's just not going to happen. Unfortunately, it's just politically not, and this ultimately does come back to politics. It's politically not feasible. Unfortunately, what the summit needs to achieve is some sort of really strong commitment at the end to how they fix that, because it's clear that, so the UK has talked a lot about, Allan Sharma, the president of COP26, has talked a lot about the need to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And clearly the climate plans in themselves do not do that. So it needs to have other stuff around that. So one idea is being floated is, at the moment, countries have promised to come back every 5 years with new plans. So 2020, the end of 2020 was the deadline. A bunch of them missed it. The next deadline is the end of 2025. Now, clearly, if the current plans put us so far off track, waiting till 2025 is not good, right? So one of the ideas being floated, and let's see whether it's got a chance or not. It's hard to tell this early out. But one of the ideas being floated is some sort of commitment at the end that there'll be a faster revisiting of the climate plan. So rather than waiting until 2025, maybe countries will come back every other year. They'll come back every some of the vulnerable countries, some of the countries vulnerable to climate change have been calling for it to be every year. And I think given the time scale and given the gap, I think that's probably a good idea. Whether that gets agreed or not is another matter. So that's one idea. There's a bunch of others, around maybe making the world's temperature target unambiguously 1.5 degrees rather than 1.5 and 2, as it sort of slightly is now in a slightly muddy way. And then there's general talk about how you need to look at it in the round, because you need to look at what other agreements are made around like fossil fuel financing and around ending deforestation. And, this is the sort of UK's language of, UK has this language of coal, cash, trees and cars, right? So the idea is there's a bunch of sort of sector specific stuff around, say, more countries following the UK's lead on banning sales of new petrol and diesel cars. If there's enough of all that stuff, then you could sort of in the round consider it a success. But clearly, in terms of your question of will it help fix the gap, sadly no is the answer.
Clearly, there's still a lot of work to be done if COP26 is going to be a success. We're going to hear next from Chris Packham and why he's concerned about what the world faces.
Well, I've filmed with Chris on a few occasions, and what I like about Chris is his passion. He is passionately involved and interested in several major issues, and climate change is one of them. And the good thing with Chris is that he's always well worth listening to.
My name is Chris Packham. I'm a naturalist and a broadcaster, and these days an ever more active environmental campaigner. I spend a good proportion of my time now trying to set the world to environmental rights with increasing difficulty, I've got to say. So I'm a busy bloke. I get up earlier and earlier every day trying to do something to make a small difference, and that's my mission at this point in my life.
So what are your concerns about climate change and how it will affect the UK?
My principal concerns when it comes to climate change is that the vast majority of people in the UK don't seem to realise that it's already here, albeit in the sense that our nations aren't on fire and perpetually underwater as we see other nations in other parts of the world with increasing frequency. When I look out of the window, I see a very different world than the one that I saw 25, and I'm 60 years old, so 40 years ago. I see significant changes in that environment which are down to climate change. The leaves come out on the trees in spring a lot earlier. Birds start to nest a lot earlier. And we are beginning to see extreme weather events. I mean, I've seen rain, the likes of which I never saw as a child in the last couple of years. So I think that at the moment, my worry is that the UK public is a little bit too comfortable thinking that it's happening somewhere else and it's not happening here. But we live on a very small world, and climate change is in our backyard. And also, it's not just about our backyard. We're all connected to those other parts of the world, which we see on the news, which are on fire and underwater. Because every time we go into a supermarket, we purchase food from other parts of the world, and that's a direct connection to it. So I'm slightly concerned that we're going to be a bit late to the table. And at this point in time, if we were all a little bit more fearful because it were hurting us just a little bit more, we would be taking action a lot more quickly than we are in the UK at the moment. I think here we're thinking it's something that we can sort out tomorrow because it's not hurting us today. But that's patently incorrect.
It's interesting. I read somewhere that the safest places to live in terms of facing climate change are between 45 and 55 degrees north. And that's exactly the latitude that UK sits on. And it also helps if you're next to the sea, which has this wonderful evening out effect on the temperature. I agree, we should be all, as Greta says, we should be panicking a bit more. We should be realising what's happening.
When I was a kid, the commer butterfly was very much a southern species. The commer is quite a colourful butterfly. It's a rich, rusty brown. It's called a commer because when it folds its wings together, underneath there's a very beautiful little silver comma on its hind wing. It overwinters as an adult, looks like a piece of rust when it hangs up in a garage, and they emerge in the springtime and their caterpillars feed on nettles. And when I was growing up in the suburbs of Southampton in the 1960s and 70s, commers were common butterflies. I see fewer of them now because we see fewer butterflies generally. Some of that's down to climate change. A lot of it's down to enormous dependence on pesticides. But had I been growing up in southern Scotland at that point in time, I would never have seen a commer at all because they were a southern species. But they're not anymore. There are species that very rapidly spread north, taking advantage of our warming and wetting climate. So that's just one example. Then there are the invasive species that we see that are coming in due to a change in conditions. And many of these are tiny. They're little pathogens and bacteria, so we won't be noticing those immediately. But how many people now in autumn go to their windowsill, look up into the corner and see a bundle of harlequin ladybirds that have chosen to hibernate there for the winter? Well, there were no harlequin ladybirds when I was a kid. This is an invasive species that's come from another part of the world, got into Europe, and now in the space of just a few years has spread very rapidly over the UK. So for me, these animals are indicators that the bigger system outside is changing. And these are two species that are changing rapidly with it. There are other species, if we stick with butterflies, a thing called the mountain ringlet. Now, the mountain ringlet is a very strange little brown butterfly. It's very hairy. And the reason it was hairy, almost mammalian in some ways, was because it needed to stay warm because it lived on mountains. Well, the mountains aren't cold anymore. So the mountain ringlet that liked it nice and cold is having to climb up the mountains trying to find somewhere cold at the top, and it's struggling to do so. So it's not a question of us, winning new species. It's a balance between gaining some and losing a lot more. And I see this really very, very clearly as an indicator of those changing conditions. And it's quite scary. And for me, at the moment, perhaps the most frightening thing is a fear of fear. We're not allowed to be frightened about anything anymore. Apparently, if we're frightened, it makes us give up and we stick our heads in the sand. Well, I don't entirely agree with that. I think a little bit of fear is a good thing. It's a highly motivational emotion. In its fundamental term, fear prompts fight or flight. And at this point, it's quite clear that there's nowhere to fly to. We've only got this one planet. Therefore, we have to fight to protect it. So I think we need to be a little bit scared of our future. In fact, I'm more than a little bit scared. I'm sometimes terrified when I read the scientists' predictions for what's going to be happening in the next 10 to 15 years. And that's not just going to be happening to mountain ringlets, commas, and harlequin ladybirds. That's going to be happening to you and me.
Am I right in thinking, Chris, when you were growing up back then, you were into sort of punk rock music?
I was into punk rock music, and one of the reasons that I was into punk rock music was that it was not just about the energy and the volume. It was about the fact that it was a music that we did ourselves. It was a do-it-yourself mantra that underpinned the whole punk movement. We weren't waiting to be discovered on X Factor or Britain's Got Talent. We borrowed, begged, or stole some money and then got a guitar, went into a garage, wrote songs about girlfriends we didn't have, and tried to get a gig down the pub. It was all about us doing things for ourselves. So that's something that my generation has carried. We're not people that wait for other people to do things. If there's a problem, we aim to sort it out ourselves. And that's why I think many of the activists that we see these days fall into two camps. They're my sort of generation, who are independent-minded, defiant, won't take no for an answer, constantly question authority, and do things for themselves. And then there's the very much younger generation who have grown into a world where they're worried about what their world's going to be able to offer them in the very near future. And these are intelligent, well-informed young people who have grave concerns about the fact that we have left them a terrible mess to either live with or sort out. And they are justifiably angry and therefore active in demonstrating their anger. And of course, they get my full support. There's no question of that.
Punk rock is, at its heart, obviously rejects excess, I guess would be one way of putting it to those that maybe don't really know the genre. But I just wonder to what extent as humans, the kind of excessive use of material things and resources around us have led us to this place.
When I was a kid and a teenager, we didn't need much. We didn't need much stuff. We needed some decent footwear and some, a decent coat, wellies. And then much later on, I got a half decent pair of binoculars. I wasn't surrounded by stuff. We didn't need to acquire stuff. But I think having gone through the 80s and 90s, now we live in a stuff-orientated world. Everyone upgrades their phone in the UK on average every 18 months. Now, my phone, I've had it for about 6, maybe even 7 years. It's still going fine. The camera is not the latest model. It's probably not the fastest phone now on planet, but it serves all of my needs on a daily basis. If I were to buy a new one, it would cost me about £1,000. But that wouldn't be the real cost of that phone. That would be the pounds cost of that phone. The environmental cost of upgrading that phone and just chucking the other one away is a lot more than £1,000. It's all the rare metals that are being mined in atrocious conditions in West Africa. It's the mistreatment of women in that region. It's the carbon cost of shipping it. It's the, and do you know what? What makes me happier? Is it my £1,000 phone now, or was it my, wellies when I was a kid, which enabled me to go pond dipping a little bit deeper than standing on the side? My phone doesn't make me happy. I need it. It's a tool of my trade. It's my mobile office. But my dogs running in the wood is what makes me happy. I think we've got to get away from this preoccupation that the mission is to get more stuff. We've all got too much stuff, and stuff is about consumption, and consumption is about using up the world's resources. And given that the population has almost doubled in my lifetime, that's a lot more people using a lot more resources. And the result of that is this vicious circle, which sees climate change as part of its circumference. So if we weaned ourselves off of this addiction to stuff, that would be a great start.
Absolutely. I don't know what your phone contract cost you, Chris, but my contract ran out last month, and the actual monthly payment cost has gone from about 40 quid a month because I was paying for the phone, and now I'm paying something like £9 a month.
Having saved some money by not renewing my phone contract, back at the City Chambers, I was keen to find out a little bit more about Councillor Aitken's take on punk music.
So I think Chris Packham's still a rebel, by the way. I think he's absolutely amazing, and he's still taken on the establishment and those vested interests, particularly on biodiversity, which is such an important part of climate action. Yes, I'm definitely a bit of a rebel. I always was. When I was in school, I didn't grow up in Glasgow. I came to Glasgow when I was 17, so I went to quite a small rural school, and I was a member of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and I used to put posters up in the school trying to get people to join my youth CND group, and the deputy head used to follow me around taking them back down again. We had a constant battle of how long my posters would stay up, and I've always been a feminist as well from when I was young. I think I was about 13 or 14 when I started insisting that people address me as Ms, and I've used that ever since. So yes, I have always had a rebellious streak, but I suppose as I've got older, I've also wanted to actually make a difference and actually be in a position to deliver change. But you still have to have a rebellious streak in order to deliver change, real change, because you're always going to have people telling you why you can't do it. I'm a wee bit too young for punk. I'm slightly younger than Chris Packham, but I was an indie kid when I was a teenager. I was into the Jesus and Mary Chain and the Smiths and lots of bands like that. Now I probably listen mostly actually to Scottish traditional music and folk music is mostly what I listen to. So Celtic Connections is every year Celtic Connections, that's my spiritual home. But my other spiritual home, I suppose, is the Queen Margaret University Union at Glasgow University. I spent a lot of time there at gigs. And in actual fact, Celtic Connections does gigs there now. So I have been back to folk gigs now at the QMU. But so music's always been very important to me and a big part of who I am and my identity, I suppose. But I'm a trad gal as opposed to an indie kid now.
And I've absolutely no doubt that the deputy head that used to take your posters down is incredibly proud of what you've done since then.
I'm not sure he will be, actually. He wasn't a fan.
Now we've sorted that out, let's go back to Chris to get a little bit of advice about reconnecting with nature, and not only the importance of nature for our planet, but the importance of nature for our own mental health.
If I were to offer advice to young people about how to reconnect with nature, and at the same time reduce some of the damaging effects of climate change and the biodiversity crisis, it would be to find that nature, to go and touch it, feel it, smell it, listen to it, taste it occasionally. And you can do that in the heart of a city. You don't need to be in the countryside. That's a complete misconception. There's a lot of fantastic nature in our cities, and many of our cities are lucky enough to have some really good green spaces, parks, and so forth. And I think that you may have been brought up to think that these places are dirty and dangerous. They're not. They're the source of a lifetime of fascination, places where you can exercise your curiosity and almost instantaneously see simply the most beautiful things that our planet has to offer. Even if you just sort of sit down on a lawn and let a ladybird, clamber up your finger, reach the tip, spin round and round, open its wings and fly off, there's enough there to, for your heart to miss a beat. And I think that in these overcrowded times, stressful times, a lot of stress is on young people now with social media and all of the needs to conform to this, that, and the other. Mental health is really important. Looking after your mental health is really important. And we know, without ambiguity, we know scientifically, having, research has been conducted and peer-reviewed and published, that being in green spaces is better for your mental health. You don't have to know what the trees are. You don't have to be into wildlife. You just have to be in that green space and you will be better. You will be calmer, less anxious. There will be chemical changes taking place in your body which will be beneficial to you. Plus, if you've walked there and back, there will be physical benefits in terms of exercise and so on and so forth. So find those places and try to fall in love with just little bits of them, or even just being there. And then, help us look after them, because they're your spaces for tomorrow. No one, owns a tree, I don't think. They claim they do. People claim that they own a piece of land and they own all the trees on it. How can you own an organism that has the potential to live for 300, 400, 500 years? In the cases of some trees in the UK, thousands of years. Yew trees live for thousands of years. You can't own a yew tree. You can look after it for a period of time, and we should all be looking after those things. So, once you've connected with that environment and you've recognized it has a value for you, then just like the rest of us, you're going to need to fight to look after it, because unfortunately the pressure on it is so great. And we need young people to be helping us in that fight to look after things, because at the moment we're losing. Every time we turn, we see something else being destroyed in the name of so-called progress. But so many of us have recognized now that that progress is fallacious. Progress at this point is about implementing all of the techniques that we have so that we can adapt for the climate change that we've already got and reduce the effects of it in the future. That's progress.
Obviously, some of our young people will recognise you from being on television and presenting these TV shows such as Springwatch and lots of other things that we're all familiar with. I guess to some extent that seems quite distant to some young people from maybe the reality of their lives. But I'm sure you yourself will find solace and take something from those green spaces as well. Is that reference to the importance of green spaces for mental health? Is that something that resonates in your own life for you when you're away from the TV cameras?
When I was a kid, I thought that I spent all my time in the what the council called wasteland, scraps of unbuilt on land between the houses where I grew up. It was never wasteland to me. It was far from wasted. It was wonderful. And then I got a bike and I would cycle out into the countryside that fringed Southampton. I thought I was going there because that was where everything that most interested me lived. All of the grass snakes, all of the birds, all of the fox cubs and things that I would go and try and find and watch and look at. But with the benefit of hindsight, I also recognized that one of the reasons that I was going there was to escape the pressures of my life. And the pressures of my life were quite severe at some points. And I was going there to escape And when I was there, I was more comfortable and I was calmer and I wasn't in conflict with the world. And as I've got older, I've realized that rather than allow that just to be an accident, i.e. continue to go out into those spaces with my binoculars, looking at birds and all the things that interest me, and the spin-off is that I feel a bit better, I now orchestrate that. So every morning I get up and I take my 2 dogs, Sid and Nancy, my mad, bad black poodles, and we go for a walk in the woods. Now, very often I don't take my binoculars and I don't see any specific nature. I'm not on a ramble looking for things like people like me normally look for. I'm just being there with my dogs, and being with them makes me happy. I walk about 10,000 steps on my dog walk, so that's physically healthy for me. But most importantly, that is a grounding point for my day. I don't use my mobile phone. I just walk. And the rhythm of my body moving through the trees allows me to, that pace to take in my environment. All my senses are working optimally because I'm not traveling too fast. I'm walking. And it's enormously beneficial for my mental health. And what I find it now is that if I'm away working, I begin to yearn for that walk in that wood with those dogs. And when I get home, it's like when I was at school, I'd just get in the door, chuck all my homework on the floor and then go and dash out into the woods. And now I come home, I throw my suitcase through the door, I grab the poodles and I go for a walk in that woods. And my partner would tell anyone that, I don't settle until I've done that. There's no point in, her wanting to sit down, give me a meal, have a conversation, see what I've been up to. It's not going to work. It will not work. I have to come back and I have to get back into that routine because I know that routine keeps me mentally healthy. And that's something that anyone can find. Find a space where you can go, where you feel better. And with the pressures on young people now, I think that, if I were in that age category, I would be actively seeking a refuge. And very often that refuge is a green space.
Absolutely. In Glasgow, of course, it is known as our dear green place because we are fortunate enough to have so many green spaces in our city. And whether that's places like Kelvin Grove Park or Queen's Park and all these other fabulous parks, or whether it is those wonderful wastelands that you described and those little bits of spaces in between buildings that can spark that lifetime of curiosity. And I guess that's something that we all just have to open our eyes to.
And of course, Glasgow has the river running through it, and the river is a conduit for all sorts of life. So if you go to the shore, even if it's a concrete shore of a river, and you peer over that water, you're sure to see something interesting at some point. And we know, again, that being near water has a calming effect. They call it the blue calming. So sitting by a pond, a river, or a lake has that capacity to calm people down. So the city's well provided for in terms of resources. You just need to actively go and engage with them.
Another good friend of mine in the wildlife filming business is Gordon Buchanan, another fellow Scot. And we'll be hearing from Gordon in other episodes of the podcast. But I want to introduce him now because he described a very good way that the world, the global leaders, ought to promise to each other that they would live up to the things that they promised to do at COP.
In our household, something that is unbreakable, that sacrosanct, is a pinky promise. So what I'd want from any politician, world leaders, sort of those that are making this, is our pinky promises on the words that they speak at COP. Because my biggest fear is that it's all the spotlight it's a world stage. It is arguably one of the most important sort of environmental summits that we've ever had. So everyone's going to be knowing what the right things to say are, but whether they know what the right things to do are long term, that remains to be seen.
I could see some of our politicians trying a pinky promise. If Kermit the Frog can make it into the UN speech, then I don't see why a pinky promise couldn't make it into COP.
Yeah, I'd love to see. David Attenborough pinky promising Boris Johnson. To be honest, that would be fun. That'd be one for the scrap.
Find a way out of it.
It would be a lot simpler than some of the than some of the things you read in the media.
Yeah.
I think everybody would understand it. That's got to be an international symbol.
Yeah. And if, like with my kids, if I ask them to give me a pinky promise and they don't do it, if they say a pinky promise isn't needed, you know that they're not going to sort of hold true to what they've said. So,
if you had to make your own pinky promise, Gordon, in terms of the changes that you'll make at a kind of personal level, what pinky promise would you make to the planet?
I think kind of the promise I'd like to make to myself, or the pinky promise I'd like to make to myself, is, to do as much as I can when I can. But life is complicated, and I do beat myself up that I feel that I've got more of a profile than sort of some other people may do, and I'm not using that profile to do the maximum amount of good. But ultimately, life sort of can be quite complicated. There's other distractions, other concerns, and other worries. So I think my sort of promise to myself is just to do what I can when I can for the good of the natural world, and hope that it does some good, or hope that maybe it inspires somebody that is going to be able to kind of take that baton and do something with it in the future.
I suppose my pinky promise to the planet would be that I will not be scared of taking hard decisions just because they're unpopular. If the hard decision is the right thing to do for the planet and for all of our futures, then that's the decision that I will make. As long as I'm in this job, that's the decision that I'll make, even though it might make me unpopular. And it might mean I'm not in this job for very long, but that's fine, because I would rather do the right thing and be unpopular. If that's the price that I pay, then that's the price that I'll pay to for the planet. So that's my pinky promise in my job as leader of Glasgow City Council. So
my pinky promise is to never stop talking about and working on climate change. That's my sort of professional level version of it. And the other one part of it is I finally need to sort out some outstanding stuff in my personal life in terms of our car and how we heat our house. So I'm working on those. I ironically moved from like a new build house to a very old period house. I had like new build house, I'd put like solar on it and insulated it perfectly. So now I need to do some more work on the older house. So those are, I don't think you should get too caught up on like individuals' actions, but I do talk about this stuff a lot. I need to walk the talk a bit more on a couple of things, particularly the car and the heating.
I think my pinky promise to the planet will be is to keep spreading the word that we can make a difference. And personally, I will try and make a difference with every single action I make.
If I was making my pinky promise, it would be to continue to do what I do with as much energy as I do, in terms of my constantly auditing my life. I constantly look at me as my organism, and I look at its impact on the planet. And whenever I'm faced with a choice, I try to make the right choice. I've got an electric car. Now, I got to the point where that became an option for me in terms of being able to charge it, being able to afford it, and being able to use it. So at that point, I exercised that choice. I'm a homeowner, therefore I can choose who I buy my energy from. I get my energy from a green energy company. Again, I make that active choice. And sometimes you can't always make that choice. There was a point where I couldn't afford that electric car. So we've got to be tolerant of one another and not think we're all going to jump and all make the changes at the same time. We don't do that. We all make changes at a different pace. Therefore, we need to be kind to one another. We need to be tolerant of one another. But as long as we're all moving in that direction, that's a good thing. So my pinky promise is that I will continue to audit my life. And when change becomes available to me, I will make that change.
The bird, the bell, the fish and the tree, a song for all children, for you and for me. This precious world is weeping, you see. It's now or never, it's time to believe. Mother